mi presentación en inglés, so por favor, usan la traducción. Créeme, no quieren escuchar mi español. If everyone is ready con la traducción, yo tengo una pregunta para ustedes. I have a question for you all. How many, if you could raise your hands, have in your job analyzed a PPP transaction? You don't count. Okay, just so I have an idea of the level that we're addressing. You may not have looked at a PPP transaction, but in the future, given the growth of this market in Latin America and the Caribbean, the chances are you will need to start to learn in the future how PPP procurement works. Because I think your skills are essential and critical to make sure these projects can be competitive and transparent. So I think it's a topic and a discussion that needs to take place. So I'm going to start with the basics, which is what is a PPP? There are many, probably, I think in the region, there's 13 or 14 countries that have PPP laws that define PPPs. And frankly, they're all a little bit different, including in Europe and other places. So what we have here is just basically what is common among them. And the common aspect of a PPP definition is it's a long-term contract between the public sector and the private sector. When I say long-term, I'm talking 20 to 30 years or more. It requires a significant transfer of risk to the private sector, both in financing, in management, and the private sector must pay for those risks too. They must cover those risks. And it also usually includes, but not always, financing from the private sector. So the government doesn't actually take out debt directly on a PPP. The private sector will do that. Although that is certainly not standard in all cases. In many cases, the government doesn't. So we're going to talk a little bit briefly, and I'll go more into these about too far, the advantages of PPPs. Why do we do PPPs? Because frankly, they're much more complex. They usually require advisors that you have to hire to help you structure them, so they're a little bit more costly. So why are governments across the region looking to this model as a way to build their needed infrastructure? Well, first advantage of a PPP is what we call, in English, all-in life cycle costing. And by that, we mean, for example, in a road, instead of just the government constructing a road, you're giving a contract where the private sector, the same entity, must construct the road, manage that road, and be responsible for maintaining it over a period of 25 years. So you bundle all those contracts. And you bundle the contracts into one big contract, and you get efficiencies in maintaining and operating the road. And also, because the private sector often brings finance to the government, you leverage private sector finance, and therefore avoid directly contracting debt by the public authority. Third, in some cases, you create fiscal space for the government to attend to other priorities, social priorities. You free up some fiscal space in the government, although you don't always do this. And a lot of people think PPPs always save the government money. But the reality is, unless you're doing a PPP like a road project that has user fees, where the society pays a toll, that is the only case where you are really freeing up fiscal resources. Because if there's no toll, who pays for that road? It's the public sector. So there's not always a fiscal savings, but potentially there can be. And then finally, private sector innovation and better project management. You bring the resources of the private sector, which is known for innovation, which is known for more efficiencies in management to the project, and the public sector can benefit from. Let's start with all-life costing. As I said, it bundles finance, operations, and maintenance. and you use performance-based metrics rather than traditional input-based approaches to procurement. So when you design a PPP, you're not designing that based on saying what goes into it, saying how much concrete, how wide. What you're doing that PPP for is against outcomes. So the design will be, I want a road, the government, the authority will say, I want a road that can handle X thousands of heavy trucks, X thousands of cars, and which will be repaired any hole within 24 hours. And I want that to be available to the society for the next 25 years. Then the government comes with its design. The private sector comes with its design, and the government sets the standards, so they monitor the outputs, They don't look at the That's a big difference. I'll go a little bit more into that. Okay. This is just the cycle here. And the last point on that is the private sector is incentivized to optimize construction and minimize the cost of maintenance. So often the cost of maintenance is less, because if you, as the private sector, have to maintain what you build, you're going to build it very well, because you don't want to have high costs for maintenance. So you build in that efficiency. So let's look at private sector investment. Again, the private sector can raise its own debt and equity to build the infrastructure and cover all the operational costs. Fiscal space, as I say, you get fiscal space when you charge user fees. If not, the government is paying. There's no free ride with the PPP. The only way you get that is by charging. Another thing people forget about the PPPs is you also tax the company when they operate. So the government doesn't tax itself when it runs a road or an airport, but if a private operator does it, you are generating some tax revenue. Now let's look at the innovation. As I said, generally in most countries, the private sector is associated with greater efficiency and innovation. They're more likely to streamline processes because they don't have all the rules and regulations we do in the public sector. And finally, by having the private sector, you get something in the PPP world we call value for money. And value for money is the way you select a PPP project. Because you should never do, as a public sector, a PPP project unless you have assured yourself that the overall cost over the life of the project in present value terms is less than if the government was to directly build that project and maintain it itself. There should be a comparative advantage, otherwise it's simply not worth it to do it. That's not necessarily how you pick the company, but that's how you decide if you're going to do the project as a PPP. I'm going to give you a little bit more on value for money because it's sometimes a hard way to look at it. So when you're selecting a project, deciding whether or not to do it as a PPP, you would look at all the risks that the government takes on, whether it knows it or not. Because if the government builds the road, and there's a storm that comes and destroys the road, who pays to fix the road? The government. So you add up the cost in present value terms of all those risks, the risk that you didn't transfer to the private sector, you add up the cost of operating and maintaining that road at a high standard, which we all know we don't always do, but if you did, you add up what that would cost. And then, if by chance there's any third-party income, sometimes there is, sometimes the government has an airport, of course it makes money from the stores, even on a road it can make money from concessions along the side of the road. You would add all that in at present value terms and look at what it would cost the public sector to do that project. Then, you would do a comparison with what it would do to cost through PPP procurement, where the private sector is going to pay to cover all the risk, do all the maintenance, the O&M, and the private sector is entitled, usually they'll ask for the opportunity to get third-party income. Third-party income, as I said, can be the stores in an airport, it can be developing the land on the side of a road, and that also reduces the cost of the project because they're earning some revenue. Then you add all that up, and in the last line, you get the adjusted net present value, the PPP terms. And if this is less than that, then you would choose to do a PPP. If not, and it's not always less than that, you should do it as a public sector. There's another chart that I just wanted to show you. It's another way of looking at it. The only reason I'm presenting two charts of the same thing is, in this case, it's just looking at the public sector comparative financing. And it's looking at the case, which is often the case in Latin America, where there are no tolls, no user fees. Let's use the example of a road, where the government is just paying on a monthly basis over 25 years to that private operator, and that private operator is covering all the O&M, all the operations and maintenance, all the costs associated with maintaining that road at a pre-agreed standard with the government, and the government has to monitor that. And if the private sector doesn't do that, you reduce the payment. That's how it works. And so you would look at the costs of the government, which in this case had to borrow the money and build the road, has to do its own O&M, and has to bear all the costs of risk from climate to anything that can affect that road over time, including decreased demand and wear and tear. Then you would take out whatever taxes you get, and the difference is called the value for money. And if there is positive value for money, again, you would choose to do a PPP. So at the next part of my presentation, I want to address, sort of at a high level, 100 miles in the air, how one would approach procurement in a PPP, and how that might be different from the way we approach procurement in our traditional government process. There's these four basic things which are common to all procurement. And whether it's PPPs or government procurement, every government should have a good strategy and a good policy. And that should be based on competition, efficiency, everything that you ensure when you look at projects that you want to see, and transparency in the project. And that strategy should cover whether it's PPPs or traditional, whether you're going to do pre-qualification, not all governments do that, some do, how the bid process works. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but in PPP, sometimes you don't use a simple like two-envelope system or one stage, you might have multiple stages. Negotiation with bidders in PPP procurement, there's a more open attitude to having communication with bidders because of the complexity of the project. And in traditional procurement, that makes procurement officials very nervous, even if it's allowed. They're very concerned. Again, the basis for the award, which may not be simply on lowest cost, because you're looking at the whole life of the project and the value for the money, as well as the cost. So a procurement strategy should be and what are the principles that are different, and how would you apply them if you look at a PPP project? Well, let's look at first the contract itself. The contract itself, there will be probably, because of the complexity of it, not just one company, but a consortium of companies. They will form an entity, in English we call it a special purpose vehicle, that will be the counterpart for the government. And the government will have one contract with that special purpose vehicle. That special purpose vehicle, which is the consortium running the PPP, they have many separate contracts, short-term and long-term. But in a traditional structure, the government will tend to have a shorter-term contract with a provider or two providers. Just to show you how it looks structurally, we put this here. In public finance, the government will contract with a construction firm, say, for the building of a road. It may, in some cases, even contract with an operating firm if it's going to contract out maintenance, or a design firm. It will have financial contracts to take on debt to build that road. And when the road is done, these disappear. And the government, the public sector, has to maintain that road in good shape over time. In a PPP financial structure, you have a special purpose vehicle here consisting of a consortium usually of firms. They have one long-term contract, a contract from 25 to 30 years, normally in Latin America. In the United States, it can go up to 80 years, very long-term. And then in turn, the special purpose vehicle will contract out the operating firm, borrow the money, hire the construction firm So it's a very different sort of structure for the procurement, which is one long-term contract versus a short-term contract.
Es realmente comparar un contrato a largo plazo versus la gestión que se realiza
PPP
de
procurement, another
contratos a
difference.
corto plazo.
In PPP procurement, the authorities have to focus on the outcomes of the projects with performance standards. It's not an input-based contract. So you're, as a government, are going to define a set of standards that that project has to achieve. It depends on the nature of the project. If it's electricity, it could be expanding it so much by a certain amount of time, including a certain number of core customers. If it's a road, it may be making that road available 24 hours a day for heavy-duty trucks and never allowing a pothole more than 24 hours. Maintaining signage, even they will specify the level of grass that should be cut. These are all outcomes of the project. But you're not looking at what does the concrete cost. You're not looking at what does the construction of the signs cost. You're looking at the outcomes of the project, and that's what you monitor in the
Usted bien
project.
tiene que monitorear los resultados una vez que ya está concluida la obra.
Which is not coming. You're more focused on the inputs and the assets without ongoing performance standards. It's up to the government to do that, but you're not imposing it on the private sector as a condition
Pero
for
que no es
this.
algo que impones al sector privado como condiciones.
So another difference.
Otra diferencia
In
entre
PPP procurement,
gestión
it's
de
like a
riesgos
marriage,
público
hopefully.
privadas
You have a
es que
long-term
se
relationship.
trabaja a una
You
relación
don't
a
hire
largo
that
plazo,
company, as hard as it is to, which I'm listening in this thing, it's not that easy to hire a company in a good way,
siempre lo
but
escucho, no es
you
algo
hire that
fácil.
company, they finish the
Se
contract and they
contrata
go.
a una empresa
The
que termine
PPP
la obra,
contract,
pero en un
the
contrato
government has to live with that
público-privado,
company for 25 or 30
tiene que
years
mantener
and
esa
monitor their
relación con
performance.
esa empresa a
And
20,
if that
25
performance
años.
is below
Y
what was
ese
agreed to,
desempeño, si ese
they have to
desempeño está por
input
debajo
the penalty.
del
They have
esperado,
to
se puede
reduce their
imponer
payment.
una
So
multa, ¿no?
it's a
Una penalidad.
long-term
Estás
relationship, therefore a very
estamos hablando de una relación
different
a largo plazo,
relationship and actually
que,
more complex for the
claro,
government.
que es más complejo para el gobierno porque es a largo plazo.
Traditional procurement, as I
En
said,
las
is basically
gestión
a
de compras
buyer-seller
tradicionales
relationship.
se basa
If
más en
once
una
the assets
relación
are
de
provided
comprador y
and the contract
proveedor.
ends, the relationship is over.
¿No? Es la relación que siempre vemos.
In PPP procurement, again, a very big difference
otro
is,
principio
and this is
en la
critical
adquisición de
for the
público-privado,
advantages of a PPP, you have to do a risk
Es que
analysis,
se tiene que realizar
a
un
very
análisis
detailed
de
risk
riesgos
analysis of
muy
the risk the
detallado
government is going to
de los
retain for
riesgos que el
itself,
gobierno va a asumir por sí
such
mismo.
as force majeure or something like that, and you're also going to list all the risk
Vamos a
that
asumir
private
todos
sector
los
has
riesgos,
to
estos
manage,
riesgos,
so that
y
they
cuáles
can
serán los
prepare their
riesgos que el
bids,
sector privado
knowing
deberá
exactly what they are liable
gestionar.
to over 25
En 25
In a
años.
traditional
Estamos hablando.
approach,
En
the
el
government
enfoque
accepts
tradicional,
all of the risk
el
of any
gobierno es el
asset
que
over the
asume
life of that asset.
todos los
So
riesgos
there's a big
en
difference
toda la
in
vida
how
del
you
proyecto.
allocate risk. And the principle
Y
in
el
a
principio
PPP
en la
is to
público
allocate
privada
risk to the
es
party that is best
destinar los
able to
riesgos
manage it.
a la parte que pueda
So we'll
gestionarlas
look at a
mejor.
little bit
Entonces,
how
aquí es
they
donde observamos
do that. This is a
cómo
typical
realizar
risk
esto.
allocation
Entonces,
matrix.
aquí
It's
quiero
not
mostrarle una
all the
matriz.
risks, and actually it's not showing up.
No, están todos los
We
riesgos
compare
detallados,
Spain and the United Kingdom,
pero
and
digamos,
how they
ponga de
allocate
ejemplo,
risk in their
en
PPP
España
contracts.
y en el Reino Unido.
You can see it's
Pueden
fairly
observar
similar. I just wanted to point out that the differences
las
are,
diferencias están
that I
las
see, initially anyways, is if there's a
vemos
change in
los
law
cambios
that
en
affects
normas,
the economic
en las
equilibrium of the
leyes,
project, who
durante
bears
la
that
vida
risk?
del
Who's
proyecto,
responsible?
¿quién va a
In the
asumir
UK,
la responsabilidad?
they
En el
managed to
Reino
get
Unido,
away with this, I don't know how, but they tell the private sector, if 5 years from now,
pero en
we decide to
5
change the
años,
law,
ellos podrían
that's your
decidir
problem. You
cambiar
have
la
to
ley.
take that
Ellos le
risk.
pueden
And they
decir
do.
al sector privado,
Just like
en
any
5 años
private
cambiamos la
sector company,
ley.
if laws
Es un
change, they have to
problema.
adopt to it.
No, la empresa
They
podría
require it.
terminar
In Spain,
perdiendo.
the
Pero en
government will say,
España
if
se le dice
the law
que si
changes
la
and that
ley
affects the economic
cambia,
equilibrium of your project,
entonces durante
then
la
we'll
mitad
sit
del
down
proyecto
and negotiate how to
nosotros nos
restore it.
sentaremos a negociar,
So there's
a
different ways of
renegociar.
allocating risk among
Entonces hay
countries. And this
diferentes
is
maneras
just an
de
example
poder gestionar los
of
riesgos.
how that's
Y por
done.
eso les muestro
And you'll notice in all the cases, Spain and
En-
England, they are
tenemos
both,
otros casos, por
the
ejemplo,
public takes responsibility for land acquisition, and I'm sure you're well aware in major
estoy seguro
infrastructure projects, one of
que
the biggest
ustedes
issues is
reconocen
acquiring the land
que
and getting the
estos
title
temas
for
se
the land.
presentan
In some cases, they do
en
allocate
los
that to the
proyectos.
private sector,
Por
but
ejemplo,
I
en
think the
la
best practice is the
adquisición o compra
government's
de
best
tierras.
way to do that. And it should be done before you
Es
sign
algo que se tiene que
contracts, so
realizar
you're not
antes de
obligating
firmar
yourself
los
before you
contratos,
come.
¿no? De verificar esto, antes que firmen ustedes.
So now we're looking at another difference, which we call, and I don't know if there's a
También
way to say this in Spanish, but in English they say market sounding. It means reaching out to the private sector, which is considered a best practice for PPPs due to their complexity and size. So before you actually do the project, you'll do sort of a concept note on the project and distribute that to the private sector. And you'll meet with key private sector players to get feedback on it before you officially go to the market. And that's something which most laws would allow, but I know from experience that it also makes our procurement officials a little bit nervous when they see people talking to individual companies. So you want to regulate that process so that it's open to all companies. You're not restricting companies in any way. And that comes with that. And in traditional procurement, normally the government has the main responsibility for the design of the project, and then they send it to the market for bidding. And there tends to be less willingness to communicate before the bidding process with prospective bidders. Not necessarily not allowed, but something that does, in general, make people nervous. And this one, the main point I wanted to make here, again, there tends to be in PPP projects more communication with bidders than most procurement offices are really comfortable with. In Europe, for example, they even have something that they've implemented called competitive dialogue, where when the bid is out there and they have all the bidders, they pick not the best, most preferred bidders, they pick the top three. And then they enter into negotiations with all three in order to try and get the best design, the best project, the most efficiency. That's not something I would recommend in countries where you have questions about transparency. But in Europe, they seem to be able to do that, to my knowledge, without major issues. There's also, mainly in Europe, they tend to do some multi-stage bidding, whereas I think in our region, we tend to have maybe one or two stages, but in cases of very complex projects, they will do the bid, receive technical proposals, review the technical proposals, and then if necessary, rebid it and open it to all the people who had preferred bids, who did well on the technical proposal, but they'll rebid it because they usually look at the bids and then try to redesign it, because the projects are very complex, so they're actually seeking input from the private sector. That's called a multi-stage bid. That tends not to be done in Latin America. So there is more of an openness for dialogue for these complex projects. And another huge difference, which is not here, but you see the title.
En el Perú no sé si se da, pero en el título se puede ver.
Just put it up there.
Propuestas
Is
no
the idea of
solicitadas.
unsolicited proposals. And it's written in many cases, including in Peru, in Colombia, and some other cases, it's actually written into the PPP law that you can receive unsolicited proposals. And I can tell you, the technicians in the PPP units hate them, but the Congresses of the countries have approved them, and I think they approved them thinking that that brings in private sector innovation and ideas on infrastructure. And these can be difficult to manage, and the disadvantages are you don't get the competition, you can have some bias, some favored bidders, some connected bidders, but these are now permissible in the region for doing PPP, so they have to be very well managed. And because they are a bit difficult, there's 4 ways of dealing with this unsolicited proposals. One is don't allow it. The UK doesn't allow unsolicited proposals because they lead to difficulty in ensuring fair and honest competition. If you do allow it, as many of the countries in the region do allow under PPP, there's 3 ways to make it fair. One is a Swiss challenge. I believe in Peru they require a Swiss challenge. The Swiss challenge simply means you get the bid, your Ministry of Planning or Economy reviews it, they decide it fits with their national strategy, their national development plan, and they're going to do it. They want to do it. In that case, that same bid is made public, and you give the opportunity for another private sector entity to provide a better price. So you force competition. That's called a Swiss challenge. That's done in Europe as well. That also has some advantages and disadvantages because the practical experiences, they never give enough time for the others to prepare. The first one may have worked a year on it. And they say, okay, 30 days, anyone want to beat the price? So it's not always the best way, in my view, to do it. The second way, which is done, I believe, in Chile, is a bonus system, where you take that unsolicited proposal and you say, it's fine, this fits our national priorities, our strategy, we like it. You make it public and you have a full competition, just like any project. You bid it out, anyone can bid on it. And you give a 5 or 10% preference to the original bidder, so that they have some advantage, but you open it to competition. Finally, the one, and I'll be honest, I think this is actually the best, is if the government agrees, yes, it's a great proposal, fits our national plans, you allow that company to be shortlisted, but with no preference, and you have an open bid, just like you would any project. And I think that's probably the best way. Not that many do it that way, but that's probably the best way to do it. In all of these, once the government accepts an unsolicited proposal under the laws that I've seen in Latin America, at a minimum, the government has to compensate the private sector proponent for any technical studies that the government uses for subsequent bids. So the private sector could potentially get their money back for what they spent on preparing. So that's a big difference with traditional procurement, where you don't see much of the unsolicited proposals. That was it. Thank you very much.